the winter of 1,892 inches. Jefferson Valley, southwest Montana, was forecast to be the deepest cold since the state's weather stations began keeping records. News from Helena sent down made it clear. Northerly winds would sweep through, splitting the valley, with temperatures potentially dropping to levels where even livestock barns would struggle to stay above freezing. In that context, the elderly widow Eleanor Bracken, nearing 70, lived quietly on the edge of the valley after the death of her husband, who had traded for many years with the Crow people. She had no children, no one to rely on, and her age made chopping wood, hauling materials, and building a cabin to settler standards nearly impossible. While 13 families in the area hurriedly rebuilt their cabins before the first cold snap, some adding more chinking, others reinforcing roofs, Eleanor did something that had all of Jefferson Valley talking for days. She began digging a tree pit shelter beneath the roots of an ancient ponderosa pine right behind her old house. They stopped their axes, stopped their sleds, and watched from a distance. An old widow, hands trembling slightly, digging a shelter alone in ground that was starting to freeze. To them, it wasn't a survival solution but a desperate mistake. No one in Jefferson Valley believed an earth dugout could hold heat. No one believed the knowledge passed down by the Crow could apply to a modern Montana winter, especially when the one putting it into practice was just an elderly woman. Whispers spread throughout the valley. She won't last 2 nights. An earth dugout can't save anyone. A cabin is what has kept people alive for generations. They believed in log walls and pitched roofs. She believed in the earth. The Crow had told Eleanor's husband that at a stable depth, the ground always held a temperature above survival threshold, even when northerly winds swept through for days on end. Eleanor had witnessed it years before and never forgotten. The community kept building cabins the traditional way. She kept digging her shelter. None of them could have imagined that her quiet decision, mocked, seen as foolish, would become the turning point of the entire winter of 1,892 and of the lives of everyone in Jefferson Valley. In Jefferson Valley, the white settlers' building philosophy was so deeply ingrained that no one questioned why they did things that way. To them, a proper cabin had to be tall, wide, and use as much wood as possible, the more the better, as a declaration that humans could control nature. Thick walls, tightly packed, chinking, pitched roofs to shed snow, and large fireplaces were the foundation of survival. They believed in a simple truth. Bigger fire means more safety. No one imagined those walls could become heat traps on nights when northerly winds blew relentlessly. They believed in survival based on walls, logs, chinking, fireplace, a system copied from northeastern U.S. traditions and applied unconditionally to the West, without considering the completely different climate. Meanwhile, the Crow and other northern plains tribes took an almost opposite approach. To them, the earth is the world's oldest stove. Below the frost line, a few feet underground, the temperature usually stayed stable around 45 degrees Fahrenheit no matter the wind or snow above. Large tree roots not only held the soil but served as natural wind braces, and snow, rather than an enemy, became an effective insulation layer. Native people didn't try to conquer nature by building thick walls. They managed heat flow, used what was available, and understood that the key to survival lay not in imposing will on the environment, but in reading its structure. Eleanor had heard all this from her husband himself. He had learned the tree pit technique over years of trading with the Crow and often explained it to her on long winter evenings. Don't dig too close to the main roots to avoid weakening the structure. The smaller the pit, the faster it holds heat. The entrance must be angled just enough from the north wind to prevent drafting, and most importantly, never use too much wood. Use just the right amount, the right way. Eleanor remembered every detail, not as someone learning a technique, but as a wife who absorbed the lessons her husband passed on before sudden death separated them forever. But to Jefferson Valley, those principles were nothing more than nonsense. People mocked Eleanor because she was old, weak, and had no man to help. They carried 1800s prejudices. Native architecture was primitive, uncivilized, and only suited to people who had remained separate from the progress of white cabin builders. The conflict wasn't just about materials, wood versus earth, but lay deep in notions of civilization and identity. To them, Eleanor was choosing something from a wrong past. To Eleanor, they were rejecting a technology the Crow had perfected over many generations. She saw the world differently from them. It doesn't matter if a house is tall or low, the one that's warm is the one worth living in. She didn't reason in terms of frontier masculinity. She reasoned from experience. From years accompanying her husband into Crow territory, from nights listening to him talk about subsurface heat in the ground, from the loss that made her understand that survival sometimes lies in the simple things others refuse to see. When rumors spread that Eleanor was digging a shelter, the community grew strangely worried. Worried that she would die and become a burden, worried that if she survived, their long-held beliefs would be challenged. Many people, in the first biting cold days, came to persuade her to give up. You can't do it. You should stay with someone. An earth dugout isn't for old folks. But Eleanor only replied once. I've lived through 2 terrible winters thanks to Crow techniques. They called her stubborn. They said old age had made her confused. No one knew that what Eleanor was protecting wasn't just her own life, but knowledge that had existed for hundreds of years before them and would endure long after a knowledge of people who understood the earth better than anyone in this valley. Eleanor chose the spot under the ponderosa pine, not because it was close to the house, but because she immediately saw what others overlooked. The ancient roots spread in a natural arch, creating a stable dome below ground. The dry soil with no signs of seepage showed good drainage, and the tree's lean shielded most of the north wind. To Eleanor, it was near-perfect conditions for starting a shelter true to the principles her husband had taught. She knelt on the ground, hardening with early cold, and dug inch by inch, each shovel stroke sending pain from her shoulders down her arms. Nearing 70 made every movement a beat slower than others. Her knees burned when shifting position. Her breath steamed in the freezing air. But she didn't stop. While the cabin builders raised walls, hauled logs, and hammered roofs echoing across the valley, Eleanor dug in silence. They glanced over, pity mixed with mockery. The old lady's digging her own grave. Snow's coming early this year. We probably won't have to wait long to see the consequences. Those words mixed with the sound of axes and wind, but she heard every one clearly. In response, she just continued her work with the precision of someone who knew a single inch off could cost a life. She dug to a depth of 4.5 feet, the level her husband had said held heat best all winter. She checked with her hand. The soil below still felt warm compared to the surface. The floor was tamped tight, then covered with a thick layer of pine needles to maintain stable moisture and prevent cold ground from seeping into her feet when she stepped down. Eleanor gathered fallen boughs around the tree base, fingers trembling from cold but careful not to break them. These would form the core of the roof insulation later, a detail many valley cabin builders didn't even notice because they believed only wood had value. In those days, one pair of eyes always watched her from afar. Owen Maddox, the 4-year-old son of the Maddox family. He didn't mock like the adults, but hid behind trees, curiously watching how an old person was doing something completely different from the whole community. Owen had heard his father say the Crow were great at reading the land. Now he saw part of that knowledge come alive in Eleanor's slow but precise movements. One afternoon, he sneaked closer and whispered, "Are you really digging this to survive the storm?" Eleanor just nodded. No need for long explanations. From that day, Owen became the silent witness to a project the whole valley deemed hopeless. When the pit reached standard size, the entrance angled properly from the north wind, and the interior began drying after a few days of ventilation, Eleanor stood and looked down at her work. No one clapped, no one praised. But in that silence, her shelter had taken shape as an unspoken challenge, a small but resolute structure quietly confronting every prejudice enveloping Jefferson Valley. Once the pit reached the required depth and size, Eleanor tackled the hardest part, building the roof and finishing the insulation layers. She selected straight, light, resilient saplings from the hillside, then dragged them to the ponderosa base, with slow but determined steps. Those saplings, about 40 inches all, were arranged into a sloped roof frame, tops leaning against the ancient trunk, bottoms buried deep into the pit walls. She lacked the strength to lift each one like the valley men, so she used leverage techniques, creating fulcrums with secondary roots, then gently rotating each sapling into place. When finished, the frame stood with weight evenly distributed. No single point overloaded, a calculation she learned from her husband when he explained how the Crow built roofs for temporary hunting pits during long seasons. On that frame, she began the first insulation layer. Spruce boughs. She layered them thickly, needles pointing down to drain melting snow while trapping small air pockets for heat retention. These boughs were the heart of the shelter's insulation, something Valley residents saw as trash, but the Crow saw as the Earth's warm coat. The second layer was bark shingles. Eleanor gathered fallen ponderosa bark pieces around the base. Their natural curve allowed tight overlapping like roof tiles. She pressed them into the boughs, piece by piece, until the roof took shape. When wind swept through the passes, the bark made a dry, rustling sound, like the shelter's own defensive breath. The final layer, and the one nature itself would complete, was snow. When true winter arrived, falling snow would form a thick blanket on the roof, insulating better than any man-made material the valley had ever known. The three layers together created an insulation system Eleanor knew would outperform the cabin builders, though they had never considered it. Next, she built the most critical design feature, a two-chamber airlock entry. The outer chamber higher, the inner lower, creating a slight bend that completely blocked north wind drafts. In traditional cabins, opening the door let heat escape instantly. In this shelter, heat stayed around 35 degrees Fahrenheit, even with repeated door openings. She tested it with her breath. With hand warmth, every detail matched Crow principles. Over the 2 nights she finished the airlock, Owen Maddox appeared quietly, bringing fresh bough bundles and helping tie connections with twine. No one knew he was there. Even he couldn't explain why he helped. But in the small oil lamplight and dancing shadows on the pit walls, a connection quietly formed between a growing teenager and an experienced old widow, as if knowledge had to be passed along an unexpected path. On the last night before the snow came, Eleanor stood before the completed roof, hand resting on bark shingles still fragrant with sap. She looked at her work, not as a refuge, but as an answer to all the doubting eyes that had surrounded her for weeks. Then she spoke softly, just loud enough for Owen to hear without turning. "If the earth doesn't abandon me, I won't abandon the earth." When Eleanor finished the roof and airlock entry, her shelter was no longer the crude dirt hole the Valley mockers claimed. But Jefferson Valley still refused to see it differently. They called it a grave hut, a shelter for someone who had accepted fate. The men building cabins on the east slope burst out laughing whenever they glanced toward the ponderosa. They bet she wouldn't last 3 nights once the real cold hit. Some even discussed who would have to deal with the body if she died inside, as if it were inevitable. The more they laughed, the clearer the irony became. Their own cabins were still unfinished, roofs not fully sealed, chinking patchy. Many homes temporarily stuffing old blankets into wind gaps. While they spent days lifting heavy logs and reinforcing walls, Eleanor, with the strength of an old woman, had completed a tight, solid, warm structure with no help beyond her trembling hands and Owen's quiet curiosity. She didn't respond to any mockery. On the midday the shelter was finished, Eleanor kindled a small fire, burning slowly as her husband had taught. She hung a thin metal strip on string to measure warmth inside, then sat and waited. In less than 30 minutes, the interior temperature rose to about 47 degrees Fahrenheit, a level cabin builders struggled to reach, even burning twice the wood if their cabins were finished. She touched the earth wall, felt the retained warmth spreading evenly like the ground's steady breath. That moment confirmed every calculation, every shovel stroke, every ache in her body had been right. But outside, thick gray clouds were already rolling over the Tobacco Root Mountains. The wind shifted, carrying knife-like cold that stung the skin. People looked up, hurriedly adding roof cover, nailing extra door latches. Only Owen quietly watched toward Eleanor's shelter, where bark shingles began softly creaking as wind licked across them. The first seasonal wind wasn't a storm, but it signaled that true trials were just beginning, and every home in Jefferson Valley, whether log cabin or tree pit shelter, would soon be tested by a winter no one was ready to face. The first night of the true cold arrived faster than anyone predicted. Wind from the tobacco roots poured into Jefferson Valley like an underground river of ice, slipping through every door crack, soaking into every log fiber. As soon as the sun set, temperatures dropped to breath-stopping levels. At the Maddox home, they burned nearly 40 pounds of wood that night alone, the fireplace glowing red but the thermometer near the window still sliding to 17 degrees Fahrenheit. The 2 children's breath formed lingering clouds in the air, and even thick blankets couldn't stop cold rising from the wood floor. "Missus," Maddox stood close to the fire all night just to keep her hands from going numb. At the Harker place, things were no better. Chinking between logs began cracking into long streaks, exposing thin gaps enough for north wind to slip through. When gusts hit the walls, chunks of mud straw mix fell to the floor. Mr. Harker stuffed them back while cursing the weather, but frozen fingers made every patch clumsy. The fire crackled from damp wood, casting flickering light on trembling walls. While the whole valley struggled to hold every degree of warmth, Eleanor's shelter existed in a different world. She sat by a small fire no bigger than a torch, yet warmth spread evenly through the pit, gently bouncing off the earth ceiling and back down. The metal strip she hung what Owen called her homemade gauge stayed steady at 45-48 degrees Fahrenheit. No wind drafts, no rattling walls, no cracking chinking. Just her breathing blending with the soft pop of dry wood. She didn't need to stay up all night tending fire. Adding 2 logs before sleep kept warmth until morning, thanks to thick boughs and the airlock blocking all north wind. From outside, the shelter seemed to vanish under snow, but inside it was a pocket of warm air working exactly as Crow generations had designed. At the Maddox home, Owen woke in the night to wind howling through the cabin roof and his mother constantly shifting to warm his little sister. He looked out the window at snow whipping against gray sky and remembered Eleanor's shelter silent despite strengthening wind. He whispered to himself, "No way it's warmer over there." But it was. In the valley, Mockery lingered. But by the second night of cold, that noise turned into strange silence. No one commented on Eleanor anymore. No one said she was about to die. They just glanced toward the ponderosa when checking their cabins, then quickly turned away, as if their eyes touched something hard to accept. That silence spread, heavier than the wind. People began realizing something they didn't want to admit. Their cabins were barely holding on, while the structure they called a grave hut showed no weakness. In fact, it was performing as if designed for exactly this weather. At the end of the second night, when outdoor temperature hit its lowest, Eleanor gently opened the airlock to add wood. Warmth puffing out was a quiet affirmation. Owen stood a few meters away, hidden behind dark trees, witnessing that moment with indescribable awe. The old woman they had mocked was sitting in stability that 13 cabins around the valley couldn't achieve. And from that night, Jefferson Valley entered a new phase, the phase of silent fear, when they were forced to watch a truth that contradicted everything they had believed until now. The third night had just begun when the second storm hit, fiercer than anything Jefferson Valley had ever experienced. Wind hammered the mountainsides like a blacksmith's blows, whipping thick layers of snow that blanketed the entire valley in just hours. When the thermometer hanging on the Maddox porch dropped to 34 degrees Fahrenheit, everyone knew the first cold snap had only been a prelude. This was the real test. Traditional cabins, already struggling in the earlier cold, now seemed to surrender completely. The Pierce family burned such a huge fire that the fireplace glowed red-hot, yet the indoor thermometer still couldn't climb above 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Their 2 children shivered uncontrollably, tears freezing into tiny ice droplets on their eyelashes. Mrs. Pierce held them close, but each gust slicing through cracked chinking felt like someone pulling warmth straight from her body. Mr. Pierce tried stuffing blankets, burlap sacks, and old clothes into the gaps, but they only bought the cabin a few extra minutes before wind rushed in again. Farther north in the valley, the Harkers fared no better. The cabin walls shuddered with every strong blast. Roof beams creaked as if ready to snap loose. Mr. Harker, the man who had mocked Eleanor the loudest, realized his fireplace was slowly giving up. He stood silently for a moment, staring at the tall flames, then at the cold shadows filling the cabin. For the first time that winter, he felt fear in its most primal form, the fear of failing to protect his family. The people of Jefferson Valley began doubting the philosophy they had trusted for generations. They had been taught that a cabin was absolute safety, that thick log walls were the answer to any winter. But now those walls couldn't hold heat, while the shelter they had scorned quietly proved the opposite. As the entire valley wrestled with skin-cutting gusts, Eleanor sat in her stable, warm space holding steady at 47 degrees Fahrenheit. The small fire before her wasn't large, but it maintained an even flow of heat inside the pit. Unlike the cabins, She didn't need to burn massive amounts of wood. She simply added small logs at the right intervals, letting warmth spread and stay trapped in the three-layer insulation. She opened her old journal and wrote a few slow lines. Nature doesn't require us to be strong. It only asks that we learn. Those were words her husband had spoken during the harshest winter they had shared with the Crow people. In the midst of the wind tearing the valley apart outside, those words rang in her mind with startling clarity. That night, Owen slipped out onto the porch despite his father yelling at him to close the door. He looked toward the ancient ponderosa pine where Eleanor's shelter lay buried under snow yet stood firm. No rattling, no falling chinking, no firelight flickering out with the wind, just the solid silence of a structure perfectly suited to the weather. He thought to himself that even if the wind took every cabin in the valley, Eleanor's shelter would still endure. Inside each cabin, confusion slowly turned into unspoken tension. People began looking at one another with eyes full of questions no one dared voice. Have we been wrong all along? The men, once proud of their cabin-building skills, hung their heads when stepping indoors, as if they had failed their families. The women clutched their children tighter, afraid to sleep even an hour, lest the cabin lose heat while they dozed. No laughter, no more mockery. The valley's pride, the belief that traditional cabins were the foundation of survival, was crumbling hour by hour. And when the wind reached its peak, howling through Jefferson Valley as if to sweep everything away, everyone understood that this winter wasn't just testing wood and fire. It was testing the convictions they had carried for generations. In Eleanor's shelter, warmth remained steady. She sat calmly, listening to the storm ravaging outside. Not a trace of fear, not a hint of doubt. The community, though they said nothing aloud, all felt the same thing. Tension had reached its height, and if the storm lasted longer, they would have to face the truth. No one wanted to confront that salvation. This winter lay not in tall walls, but in what they had once despised, the knowledge a widowed old woman had quietly preserved. As the second storm moved into its fourth night, Jefferson Valley could barely hold on any longer. When temperatures fell to levels where outdoor metal froze in seconds, the Pierce home lost all ability to stay warm. Their youngest son, only 8, began complaining of pain in his fingertips, then turned purple. Mrs. Pierce pressed his hands against her chest, but her own body warmth was no longer enough. Mr. Pierce looked around the cabin, chinking scattered on the floor, fire dying down, wind cutting through his back in cold streams, and realized that if they stayed a few more hours, the boy could lose fingers, or worse. In desperation, he wrapped the child in double blankets, then led the whole family out of the cabin. Wind battered them so hard that every step became a struggle. He hurried toward the ancient ponderosa pine, the place he had mocked just days earlier as a grave hut. Mrs. Pierce pounded on the shelter door, hands shaking violently. Please, save my child. He can't feel anything anymore. Eleanor heard the knocking, came to the airlock, and opened it. The moment the earth door swung aside, a thick wave of warmth rushed out, so dense and real that the entire Pierce family paused in shock. They stepped inside, as if falling from a blizzard world into an unbelievable pocket of warmth. Eleanor examined the boy, gently touched his swollen, graying fingers, then carefully placed his hands near the small fire. Not too close, she said. Slowly, or the skin will crack. Sobs caught in Mrs. Pierce's throat. Meanwhile, farther north, the Harker cabin was nearly collapsing completely. Their home couldn't hold above 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and their 2 children began gasping from the cold. Mr. Harker knelt beside the dying fireplace, hands trembling from exhaustion. He still had the habit of barking orders, but now his voice was barely a whisper. When he realized fire could no longer save them, he stood, draped coats over his children, and called his wife. Let's go. We have to get to her place. Mrs. Harker froze. You mean? Yes. The old woman. Her shelter. They stepped into the storm. Wind was so fierce that each gust pushed them back several steps. Their older daughter nearly fell repeatedly. Mr. Harker had to yank her arm to keep her upright. When they reached the tree, he nearly collapsed. Owen, standing watch outside to check on the Pierces, ran over to help the child. Harker pounded the shelter door with whatever strength remained, a weak but desperate sound. Eleanor pulled the earth door open. Golden light from the fire fell across Mr. Harker's face, and in that moment the loudest man in the valley was speechless. He crumpled near the entrance, voice breaking. "Please, let us in. We can't take it anymore." Eleanor helped him, though her own strength was limited. She guided the whole family inside, then closed the airlock. Warmth spread over them like an invisible blanket. Mr. Harker sank near the fire, clutched his head, then suddenly burst into heavy sobs, the crying of a man who hadn't allowed himself weakness for years. "We were wrong," he choked. "We were fools because of pride, because we thought thick wood was everything, because we thought you'd die before we even finished our cabins." The air inside the shelter was so quiet that the soft crackle of burning wood was clearly audible. Every eye turned to Eleanor, the woman they had belittled, mocked, excluded from community gatherings, yet who now alone maintained steady warmth in the valley. Eleanor added 2 more logs to the fire. They were from her carefully calculated reserve meant for the storm's final days. But she didn't hesitate. "No one survives on pride," she said, her voice low and steady. "We survive by learning from the earth." No one replied. Some bowed their heads, some covered their faces in shame, some simply sat silent with tears streaming. In that small shelter, with the howling wind now sounding like a distant echo, Jefferson Valley shed the rigid pride it had clung to for generations. In that moment, Eleanor was no longer the mocked outcast. She became the one who had saved their lives, a reversal no one in the valley would ever forget. When the second storm finally broke, Jefferson Valley emerged from days that had felt endless in bone-cutting cold. Snow lay everywhere, many cabins tilted from wind damage, chinking scattered across the ground like ash after a fire. But near Eleanor's shelter entrance, warmth still lingered in the air, as if that spot belonged to a different winter. The families she had saved returned to their cabins with a mixture of gratitude and stunned disbelief. They couldn't comprehend how a small shelter dug by a nearly 70-year-old widow could withstand 2 cold waves that proper cabins could not. That amazement quickly turned practical. They needed a solution before the next cold hit, because Montana winters never stopped after just 2 storms. The first to return to Eleanor was Mrs. Pierce, then the Maddoxes, followed by 3 families from the valley's south end. They didn't come to seek refuge again, they came to learn. For the first time in decades, Jefferson Valley residents stepped into the yard of someone they had previously scorned, and no one carried pride. Eleanor walked slowly with them to the ponderosa pine, using a stick to point at the ground while explaining how she chose the site. The soil must be dry, the roots must form a supporting arch below, and the north wind side needs shielding. They listened without missing a word. She showed them how to dig a wind berm, a gentle curved earth ridge on the north side to deflect cold airflow, something cabin builders had never considered because they were too fixed on thick walls. She demonstrated placing boughs for proper drainage so needles wouldn't trap moisture. She taught using bark shingles in overlapping layers, not pitched like cabin roofs because shelters needed natural moisture escape. When explaining the airlock, she had them stand at the entrance to feel the difference when the inner door sat lower than the outer. "Heat stays here," she said, "because no draft can pull it out anymore." 6 families began digging temporary shelters under her guidance, and in just 2 days, basic pits took shape. None were as refined or sturdy as Eleanor's, but each held warmth many times better than the cabins they had abandoned. Valley children, who had once feared the ponderosa because of superstitious stories adults invented, now gathered near it, pointing and whispering about how Mrs. Eleanor did it. They called her Old Woman of the Warm Earth, a childish yet reverent nickname that spread faster than falling snow. The adults, though quieter, began looking at Eleanor in an entirely new way. No one called her shelter a grave hut anymore. No one saw her knowledge as a mistake. Instead, they regarded her as the only person who truly understood this land better than they did, and realized that what they had dismissed had saved their lives in the harshest winter Jefferson Valley had ever seen. And when they looked toward the distant mountains where new gray clouds were forming, everyone knew that from now on they would no longer build cabins the old way. They would dig shelters, they would learn from her, and the knowledge they had once mocked had become the valley's very foundation for survival. In an instant, Eleanor was no longer just a quiet widow living on the valley's edge. She became the person the entire community had to follow, the one who proved that sometimes, to survive, people must bend down and listen to the earth rather than stand tall and fight it. When the first spring sun rose over the Tobacco Root Range, Jefferson Valley looked like a still but exhausted painting. Melting snow ran in patches down earth channels, exposing leaning cabins, sagging roofs from wind weight, and woodpiles reduced to mere scraps. No one would forget the winter just past, but they hadn't yet grasped the full extent of destruction until they began tallying everything. The first to make comparisons was Owen. He recorded on a small slate the amount of wood the Maddox family used, nights they stayed awake tending fire, times the cabin dropped to dangerous cold. The numbers stunned him. The Maddoxes had burned roughly 20 cords, not counting old furniture and a door sacrificed during the worst week. When word spread, other homes checked their own. The Pierces used 18 cords plus a wooden cabinet they had to burn to keep their child from freezing. The Harkers were worse, about 22 cords, and even burned an old bookshelf Mr. Harker had inherited from his father. As Valley families recorded their totals, all eyes turned to Eleanor's shelter, the place no one thought could hold enough heat for a full winter. But her logbook was clear. She had used a total of 4.5 cords. Nothing extra. No furniture. No building materials burned. Just wood. The right amount. The right way. That figure spread through the valley like a shock. The men, once proud of their cabin-building skills, now faced a truth no one wanted to admit. They had burned 4, even 5 times the wood an old widow used, yet their cabins remained far colder than her shelter. The second shock came when people noticed their own physical changes. While other families lost 15 to 25 pounds from cold, sleeplessness, and exhaustion, Eleanor had gained 4 pounds. Her body wasn't drained. She didn't shiver. Her hands weren't deeply cracked like the other Valley women's. She had lived in warmth, natural sleep cycles, an environment without drafts. In the Pierce cabin, they discovered water in buckets, frozen half an inch thick, clear proof their home had dropped to levels unsafe for survival. By contrast, in Eleanor's shelter, food didn't spoil. Potatoes retained moisture. Hanging meat didn't freeze solid. Tin containers didn't rust. Metal tools didn't crack. Everything looked as if it had come through a mild fall rather than a historic Montana winter. That contrast left many bewildered, some ashamed. Some felt exposed in limitations they hadn't wanted to acknowledge. And some, especially those who had been loudest, stood before Eleanor's shelter unsure where to begin an apology. Mr. Harker was the first to approach. He brought a few remaining boards from his wind-damaged cabin and quietly placed them at her door, not for burning, but as a symbol of admitting defeat. "We believed the wrong thing," he said. "We believed in walls without understanding wind, believed in roofs without understanding earth." The other men stood beside him, nodding but silent. Their silence no longer carried contempt. Like early winter, it held respect mixed with remorse. For the first time in years, Jefferson Valley slowed enough to see what they had overlooked. Earth wasn't just ground to build cabins on. It was a stable heat system the Crow had understood long ago. And the only person in the valley who had learned it and passed it on was the one they had considered weakest. As spring opened its first days of renewal, the community understood their lives had changed forever. Not because their cabins were ruined, but because the beliefs they had clung to for generations had failed the test. Right and wrong were no longer debatable. They lay in the numbers they had recorded and in the warmth of the shelter they had once mocked. As Jefferson Valley fully entered spring, the sound of melting water running down hillsides felt like a long release after the harshest winter in regional memory. But for many, renewal didn't come only from warming sunshine. It came from what they had learned in the freezing darkness. Knowledge a widowed old woman had steadfastly preserved despite mockery, disdain, and being seen as out of step with the times. In the weeks that followed, Valley families didn't return to old thinking. Instead of rushing to repair cabins, they gathered around Eleanor's shelter, bringing notebooks, shovels, picks, and a humility the winter had forced upon them. They copied every detail. 4.5-foot depth, entrance angled away from north wind, sapling selection, bow layering, 3-tier roof construction, They also noted the quiet but life-saving things Eleanor said. The earth will hold warmth if we let it do its work. Snow isn't the enemy. Snow is heaven's blanket. Wood isn't for burning a lot, it's for burning right. From 1893 to 1895, the method they named the Bracken Root Shelters spread beyond Jefferson Valley like a natural current. 32 shelters were built across nearby mountainsides, and even areas downstream along the Missouri River began adopting it after hearing that an old woman nearing 70 had survived cold that log cabins couldn't handle. Bracken shelters weren't pretty like cabins, weren't tall, didn't carry the imposing look Americans of that era often attached to architecture, but they were practical, stable, and so energy efficient that earlier Mockery now seemed absurd. In 1901, when the County Survival Bulletin compiled the most effective regional survival methods, Eleanor Bracken's name appeared with a simple description: the woman who listened to the earth. Not pioneer, not innovator, not survival expert, just a short phrase. But Valley residents knew no title was more accurate. She hadn't invented anything new, she had simply preserved knowledge no one else would hear. Through the 1,930 seconds, when archaeologists and field engineers surveyed remaining shelters in Jefferson Valley, they measured the roof insulation R value, a figure nearly matching modern Chicago basement standards. Those scientists were so astonished, they wrote in their report that this structure reflects an extraordinarily deep understanding of heat transfer, rivaling any contemporary building technique. When geothermal studies gained attention in the 1,960 seconds, a team of engineers from Montana State University returned to the valley to remeasure subsurface temperatures. They confirmed natural soil stability at 4-5 feet, matching exactly what Eleanor had applied almost 70 years earlier. They concluded, communities living close to the ground understood this mechanism long ago. The rest of us simply forgot. Throughout all that time, Eleanor was no longer alive to witness the belated recognition. She passed away on a peaceful morning inside the very shelter she had dug with her own hands, the one that had once saved the entire valley. The people built no statue for her, named no street after her. What they kept was the story passed from adults to children, then from those children to the next generation. In the children's telling, she was old woman of the warm earth, the one who taught them that survival isn't a confrontation with nature, but a simple acknowledgement that nature always has its own laws. And whenever facing a new winter, anyone in the valley would remember the final saying regarded as the philosophy of the entire method. Science isn't always new. Sometimes it's just what the ancients understood, and we forgot. In that way, Eleanor Bracken didn't just change the fate of one winter. She changed how an entire region rediscovered wisdom forgotten for generations. If you find this story offers a fresh and valuable perspective, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next survival journeys. Thank you for joining us. See you in the next video.